Hi, everyone. I hope you are doing well and having a good summer so far. So welcome to week 4. So this week will be the midpoint of our course. I know the summer just flies by. We've already completed 3 sets of discussions and we have 3 more sets of discussions to go. So here are the announcements for this week. We do have an assignment this week. Our second reflection is going to be due this Wednesday, June 29th. Now, again, this is the same length as the first one, about 300 to 500 words, half a page to a full page that you'll upload to iCollege. And for this one, it's very open-ended as to what you want to reflect about. There are some prompts for iCollege if you're feeling stuck, but for this reflection, I'm looking for you to talk a little bit about what has resonated with you with the course, any tensions that you feel about the readings with the course, or any other reflections you have looking back based on the readings that we've done so far. So again, half a page to a full page to iCollege that you will submit this week, and that is worth 10 points. As far as the perusal discussions, keep up the great work. This week, we've had some of our most successful discussions, particularly discussion 3A. There was super high participation in that, great dialogue on both of the discussions this week. In one tip, I saw that a lot of people this week were definitely trying to comment on each section of the assignment. That makes a big difference. And you are able to go back and continue to add annotations to any discussions that you're still working on. I'm going back as well as I see additional comments come through. So you are able to continue working on any of those discussions. And if you have a question about your grade for any of those, please reach out to me via email so we can talk about that. And remember, for the perusal discussions, you do have, there's 12 opportunities and I'm grading 10. So you do have an opportunity if you are going to be out of town or something like that to miss a week or skip a week. Also the Zoom. So thank you so much to everyone who came to the Zoom on Tuesday. I think that that is a better time for most people. I know there's a couple people that it still doesn't work for. But thank you so much to everyone who came to that Tuesday discussion. I really enjoyed it. So if you're able to, we are going to continue with that time this week, Tuesday from 5:15 to 6:15. And if you come to the Zoom, that will count as 4 points towards one of your discussions for the week. So this week for either 4A or 4B. So that was really great this week. Discussion leaders, I've really been impressed with the thoughtful presentations and the additional work that you've done to provide additional context and additional readings and connections for people to think about, as well as the questions and the facilitation on perusal. So do check with the discussion leaders. I know you have to check 2 different places, but the discussion leader presentations are posted on iCollege on a discussion board so everyone has access. And then the discussion questions are on perusal. And again, several people this week submitted their special topics. So for your special topics, you are choosing an area that you are interested in and giving us a short presentation about some of the issues around that, whether it be guns and school shootings, mental health. A lot of people have talked about critical race theory and some of the issues surrounding that recently. So any issue that resonates with you that is related to social and cultural context of education will likely be appropriate for this assignment. So you have a few more weeks to think about your proposal. So if you get a chance, again, in iCollege, that you can submit this topic. I'll put a link for this on this week's description as well in the announcements tab, and I can give you feedback there about your topic. Okay, so those are the announcements for this week. Let's go ahead and get into our reflections on this week's discussion. So this past week's discussion. So this past week, we had discussions 3A and 3B, and these discussions centered on seminal cases around school desegregation. We started off with Mendez versus Westminster, and then we read about Brown versus Board of Education. So like I mentioned, these were very robust discussions, very timely, great connections. I really appreciated all of your links and insights, personal experiences, and reactions to both of these articles. As far as the first one, when we were considering Mexican American rights in the United States, it was really interesting, and several of the discussion leaders pointed this out, as well as several of you in the comments and perusal, the intersection of Mexican American rights and Japanese American exclusion that we're going to be reading about this week. So there's in the perusal, someone mentioned this book. This is a book for middle grades. It is historical fiction, but it is based on the Mendez versus Westminster case, Sylvia and Aki. And this talks about how Sylvia Westminster, Sylvia Mendez, her family, they moved to this farm during the same time as Japanese exclusion and forced removal into internment or concentration camps that we're going to be reading about this week. So this is Sylvia and this is Aki, and there is a podcast that was recorded in 2017 that I put in supplemental readings for this week. So if you want to listen to them dialoguing just within the past 5 years about the intersection of their two families and these parallel instances of exclusion in the United States and their friendship over time. So again, this is a fiction book, and then there is a podcast under supplemental readings if you're interested in hearing more about that story. But that was a great connection that will bridge us into this week's readings that I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. I also wanted to share with you one, oh no, okay. I wanted to share with you a book that really resonated with me. And this is not included in the supplemental readings or the required readings, but I did want to tell you a little bit about this book for anyone who is interested in maybe checking out this book or looking up the author, hearing talks from her on YouTube. But this is the theory of subtractive schooling. And this reminds me a lot of the theory of miseducation. And so in this theory, the researcher is talking about, she did a case study of 2 different high schools in Texas, and she had this theory of, through doing an ethnography, she stayed in the schools for over 2 years, going there almost on a daily basis, just to become immersed in what the experience was like for Mexican American students at the schools. And she noticed that there were a lot of trends as that were experienced by different generations of Mexican immigrants. So she came up with this theory of subtractive schooling, in which the longer that students experience schooling in the United States, the more the dominant US schooling takes away from the identity and Mexican American culture that many immigrants had when they came into school. Another thing that really resonated with me with this book was the concept of care. And she talked a lot about the Mexican word for education, how that term was wrapped up in the meaning of care, and how a lot of Mexican American students, when encountered with US schools, they felt dissonance because there wasn't that same approach of care that they were used to in their schools in Mexico. So this book was really, really good and important, theorizing for understanding the experience of Mexican American immigrants who attend school in the United States, and how the experience actually can take away from their identity and subsequently their education, because they are not affirmed in schools in this way. And she also talked a lot about how this process also impacts the way that white educators view Mexican American students when they have their attitudes towards schooling, even though the school was really the cause for this dissonance between Mexican American immigrant students and the US schooling. And then there's also a chapter in the supplemental reading about Puerto Rican students in US schools. It's a brief history of Puerto Rican schools, students in US schools, and goes into the impact of colonialism, exclusion, migration, and how that has impacted the the experience, talked about how in the United States, 20% of Latino students are Puerto Rican. And this really gives some important context to what that experience is like. So if you're interested, there is an excerpt by this author in the supplemental readings as well this week. So when we were reading for discussion 3B about Brown versus Board of Education, one thing that really stuck out to me in reading through your discussions was this theme of the impact of missing history. And so the first article that we read that came from this book, The Pursuit of Racial and Ethnic Equality in American Public Schools, titled The True Story of Brown versus Board of Education, that gave some additional context about the case and why it was chosen and all of the work that led up to it. A lot of comments were, a lot of people commented about how interesting it was how the sort of dominant telling of Brown versus Board of Education is that not only were schools segregated, they were grossly unequal. And while in many cases, unfortunately, that was true, that narrative excludes the Black communities that had flourishing schools. They talked about in that article about how in Topeka, Kansas, their schools were not run down. They were well kept. There were Black teachers with advanced degrees, that they had a good education. And so this narrative that is too often taught in schools, and many Americans think, where Brown versus Board of Education overcame this issue, really perpetuates a post-racial narrative to where everything is equal now and everything is integrated now and everything is better. And while segregation, a lot of people mention, is inherently unequal, that narrative, that sort of streamlined single story, discounts everything that was lost with a desegregation, a forced desegregation approach versus integration. And it promotes also this covert anti-Black rhetoric in which white schools are positioned as superior. And so by desegregation, by inserting African-American students into white schools, that was not necessarily the aims of many of the plaintiffs who were fighting for this, as opposed to integration, where, like we read about in the article, the neighborhood was already integrated. So instead of combining the strengths that were happening in Black schools led by Black teachers with advanced degrees that were had more advanced degrees than their white counterparts, instead of fostering and building on those strengths in a way that was integrated, as opposed to being built on this white supremacist notion that segregated schools was the aim to benefit whites, as Derek Bell talked about. Instead of going with that integrated approach, we have this, we had forced desegregation, which created a set of new problems that we're going to be reading about this week. So I thought that there was really good discussion about that. Another theme that was really interesting was this theme about exclusion, housing, and property tax, and de facto segregation. We talked a lot about this for those of us that came to the Tuesday discussion, and then there were also several comments and perusal about this, about how while this court case made it illegal to have segregated schools, how there are still so many practices that perpetuate inequity in our schools today. And then another really somber point that came up this week had to do with the Supreme Court case with Roe versus Wade being overturned. And several people mentioned this in the discussion about Brown versus Board of Education and other cases. And this theme, this thread of reclamation, made me think about Derek Bell and the interest vergence dilemma. And Derek Bell warned that that oftentimes civil rights legislation is only passed if it also benefits whites. And then he also cautioned that too often that convergence is temporary. And so this is a theory that I've been reading about recently, and this is they're calling this theory the cedar theory. And so they are building on Derek Spell's theory of interest convergence and Cheryl Harris's theory of whiteness as property, and using a lens of convergence, divergence, and then reclamation. And in this article, they use the example of affirmative action legislation to talk about how when these policies, these interest convergence policies that advance civil rights, when they no longer benefit whites, how white people tend to use the law to reclaim their own rights and roll back some of those rights. And I know that that has been something that has been on a lot of our minds, really definitely poignant during this last week and as we read. And so that definitely ties into the readings this week, particularly readings for B, as we consider the policies and the practices that have ensued post Brown versus Board of Education. Okay, so the first discussion that we're going to have this week for Asian American exclusion and invisibility in education. First, we are going to read about the issue that we talked about just briefly last week when we read about Mexican American rights in terms of the intersection with the Mendez case, with the forced removal of Japanese Americans from 1942 to 1946. So during World War II, there was this forced removal of Japanese Americans from their homes into internment camps, which most of them were, 2/3 of them were American citizens. So internment camps is not the most accurate word. These relocation camps, these concentration camps where Japanese Americans were forced to live in very small quarters, to leave their homes on short notice, and was built on racist ideas at the time. So the first article that we are going to read is a little different from the other articles that we've read because it is written from the perspective of art education. So this article talks about children's art inside of the schools on the camps. And it's really interesting because they have a lot of photographs and pictures of art and talk about how the role of art, but you can get an idea of what it was like during this time and how the exclusion was represented in children's artwork. So that article will be the first article that we read about that. And then the second set of articles there, we have a YouTube video, and then we have another article about the myth of the model minority. This stereotype that is often attributed to Asian American students and how that stereotype affects them in schools, and how ultimately that this theory of the model minority upholds white supremacy by positioning other minority groups against Asian Americans and creating this tension that ultimately benefits white people. So in the supplemental readings, I did include a few articles that I think are really interesting. The first one is, what I like about this one is that it uses Twitter as a data source, and it talks about the Stop Asian Hate movement. So it is more timely than the other pieces that we're reading in that it considers the aftermath of the pandemic and how there was this strong resurgence of Asian hate that came out of largely from Donald Trump's anti-Asian rhetoric during the pandemic. So this article talks about how this discourse was perpetuated on Twitter, and then also the Stop Asian Hate movement on Twitter, which connects to some of the comments that you made on Perusal about youth movements and how social media is an avenue for people to share their voice. And then there's another article about the sense of belonging of children in US schools, and how Japanese families have their experiences with feeling like they are a part of their schooling experience. Okay, so the second discussion, if 4B, is race, politics, and practices post-Brown. And so this is going to consider, I know that we discussed Brown versus Board of Education, some of the missing history, some of the causes and the circumstances around the case. And then we focused a lot on the work of students, Black youth at the time, their advocacy, and everything that they did to ensure that their rights were heard, and that a lot of these practices were brought to the forefront in terms of creating more equitable schooling. And so the articles that we're going to be focusing on in this discussion center around that notion of desegregation versus integration, what was lost, what was gained, and who ultimately benefits, and what we can do to move forward now. And so the first two articles that we're going to be reading come from this series from the American Educational Research Association, AERA, which is the largest association of researchers in education. They have a large annual conference, and then they also, starting in 2004 at the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, they started a lecture series, which a scholar who writes about equality in education gives a lecture about the status. And many of the scholars who have given the Brown Lecture in Educational Research have been authors that we've already read about: Gloria Ladson-Billings, Richard Milner, who we are going to be reading this week. And he also is the editor of a journal that we've read several articles from. So quite a few of them. I'm also going to, in the description box of this video, I'm going to link the YouTube playlist that has all of the Brown lectures if you're interested in checking those out. There's also lectures that accompany each of these that we are going to read about. So the first one is by Teresa L. McCarthy, who we read about the first week in discussion 1A about Indigenous education. And the title of her paper is "So That Any Child May Succeed: Indigenous Pathways Towards Justice and the Promise of Brown." So this article is going to tie together some of the issues that we read about the first week in the first discussion. And many of you are still talking about that in perusal, making those connections. And those will come up in this article as well. And then the second article is by Richard Milner, who is a professor at Vanderbilt Education at the Peabody School of Education. He is the editor of the journal Urban Education, and he is actually the current president of AERA. So the annual meeting will be this April in Chicago. If you're interested in submitting a proposal, those proposals are due at the end of July. Email me if you're interested in doing that, and I can give you some tips on submitting a proposal for that conference. So he is, like I mentioned, he's the president, but he did the 15th lecture. And his paper is called "Disrupting Punitive Practice and Policies, Racing Back to Teaching, Teacher Preparation, and Brown." And he has a lot of really thoughtful articles written about race and inequity in education right now. So I encourage you to look him up as well. And then the last article that we are going to read is called "The Politics of Education in the Post-Brown Era: Race, Markets, and the Struggle for Equitable Schooling." And so this article is going to talk a lot about how post-Brown, how there has been this trend towards commercialization and profiting off of education. A lot of you mentioned this in the comments as well, with No Child Left Behind, Every Child Succeeds Act, and then standardized testing, high stakes testing. And we're really going to move into this week, and then we have several other discussions as well that are going to consider the impact of some of those educational reforms and how those those reforms happened after Brown versus Board of Education and their impact on students, particularly Black students, Latino students in the United States. And so there is another supplemental article that I highly recommend, and it's in the supplemental readings. And this article, again, is by Richard Milner. This article, I think that you will really enjoy, particularly if you were writing the comments about everything that was lost with forced desegregation, the mass firing of veteran Black teachers, the dismantling of the Black educational experience that was very cultivating and nurturing for a lot of students. This article is called Black Teachers, Black Students, Black Communities, and Brown Perspectives and Insights from Experts. And this is going to talk a lot about that very issue that many of you were discussing about what happened to those schools, those teachers, and how does that impact where we are today. So I strongly recommend this article. Again, that is in the supplemental readings. Okay, so that is an overview of the discussions for this week. So here is your checklist for the week. So on Tuesday, we're going to have the optional Zoom discussion. So if you're able to, I would love for you to come. If you come to that, you have earned 4 points. So you can apply that to either discussion 4A or 4B. And then on Wednesday, that is when perusal 4A is due, and then also your second reflection. Again, not long, just a brief reflection, checking in at the midpoint of the semester. Where are you at? What are you rethinking? What's resonating with you? What tensions do you feel? Feedback for me, anything that you are reflecting on that you would like to share. And then Sunday, July 3rd, perusal 4B. And then upcoming, just so you can be thinking about it, July 6th is when your special topics proposal is going to be due, just so you can start thinking about something that you are interested in doing. So that is the recap for this week. Again, thank you so much for all of your thoughtful comments and your discussion leader projects. I'm working to give everyone feedback, so do check for that. And I will hope to see you Tuesday. And if not, I will see you in perusal and look forward to reading your reflections and hope that you are doing well and have a great week. Bye-bye.